you who I don't know, I'm Robin Niblett, Director of the Institute, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you here this evening, but also Dr. Joan Leu, the International President of Médecins, Sans Frontières, who we're going to be in conversation with this evening. And I say in conversation because she must feel like she's getting a little tired of Chatham House, because she opened our conference on pandemics and epidemics here yesterday in front of a lectern with a PowerPoint and a full speech. And I said to her, I hope this is going to feel a little bit more relaxing this evening, though I think for somebody leading a group like MSF, relaxing is not what comes with the job description. And you, our members, and others not in the room today, voted MSF the winners of the 2015 Chatham House Prize earlier this year for the remarkable work that you and your colleagues undertook in confronting the Ebola epidemic outbreak last year, in particular in West Africa. Not just the work done in the field, but also the work undertaken more broadly in raising the profile and the need for a response at a time when the world was not engaging the way that you felt they should be, and turned out, of course, to be right in doing so. When we get into conversation, obviously we'll talk a bit about Ebola, but we will also address some of the many other crises that you and your colleagues are facing and dealing with around the world. It is a dangerous place out there, and the Médecins Sans Frontières tend to go to the dangerous places, and we will get probably to Yemen or to Darfur, South Sudan. But we will probably also touch on Afghanistan. I think there was no greater need for a reminder of the danger that you and your colleagues have put yourselves in front of over the decades, and you've been involved with MSF, and well, that I'm aware of since '96, so nearly 20 years. There's no greater reminder of the risks than the tragic loss of life that took place in Kunduz back about 2 weeks ago now. So I just want to say, Joanne, right at the beginning, on behalf, I think, of all of the membership of Chatham House, how much we share that loss, and wish the families and so on of those who lost their lives in Kunduz, and I might say those who lost their lives in your staff as well during the Ebola epidemic, the very best, and our condolences for the future. So I want to just make that point right up front, and we'll have a chance to address this again later on this evening. Joanne, as I said a minute ago, took over as, well, didn't took over, she joined MSF back in 1996, so nearly 20 years ago. And you were in the field. I was having a little look through here, that your career with MSF almost tracks some of the biggest crises that I think of when I think of humanitarian crises around the world. You were dealing with Malian refugees in Mauritania. You were involved in dealing in the post-tsunami context in Indonesia, I presume in Aceh and that part of the world there. The earthquake and then cholera epidemic in Haiti, Somali refugees in Kenya, and also some of the comprehensive medical care for the survivors of sexual violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's a dangerous and tough world when we run through this list, but this is what you and your colleagues are engaged with. And prior to this, you'd worked in Palestine, Central African Republic, and also in the Darfur region of Sudan, which saw some of the worst atrocities in a long list of terrible tragedies in that particular part of the world. But you trained also, before you got into McGill University of School of Medicine, specializing in pediatrics, and you have a fellowship in pediatric emergency medicine from the New York University School of Medicine. I've been talking to other people about you, Joanne, and I know you very much come at this as having been a practicing person in the field. And obviously not just simply having to represent MSF, but when you do represent and when you go internationally, you go and become part of the teams, as I understand it. And we'll have a chance to come to that in a minute. But let me just kick off here by saying, maybe you could share with us, as our members voted for MSF on the back of the Ebola, if we could start with that for a minute. What have been some of the biggest lessons you learned from that? It seems to me that MSF played a very particular role there, not simply dealing with the crisis, but really acting as the alarm bell for the rest of the world. Is that alarm bell playing role, that need to get to the media, to get the message out, as important for MSF almost as the work you do in the field?
Oh, thank you for that nice and long introduction. With respect to Ebola, I really do think that our biggest lesson learned is the fact that we didn't know that the world was not ready to answer the epidemic. And we didn't know that they were not willing to answer it. And it's something that it knocks at the door of Europe and the US, that all of a sudden the world pay attention. And it's very, very, I would say, distressing and unsettling to realize that. And this is what we see again with the migrant refugee crisis. It's the same thing. It's right now. The migrants and refugees are knocking at the doors of Europe, and all of a sudden it's an issue, and we have to pay attention. The reality, this has been going on for years, if not decades. Of course, this year, the movement of the population is much bigger than what it used to be, but this is something is unless somehow we don't feel, the Western world don't feel his interest being at stake, all of it, they don't pay attention. And this is why there's so many crises that are off the radar, like the one you've mentioned, like South Sudan. I just returned from there a few days ago, or Central African Republic. Nobody talks. Nobody talks about those crises.
And actually, I think people were surprised to learn that one of the biggest sources of refugees, asylum seekers into Europe recently have been from Eritrea, a part of the world that's almost been off the radar screen of European newspapers for quite a long time at the moment. But it seems that across parts of Africa, not just West Africa, but the Horn of Africa, there's been a persistent flow of conflicts that have, do you think they have broken apart systems of governance, of sustenance for populations? Are people just evacuating these countries? Is this the beginning of a longer term process, you think, of people just trying to go to where security is, let's say therefore in Europe? Is this conflict by conflict, or are we on something sort of bigger?
I don't think I have the visibility on that per se, but the reality is I see it more like a presto, and then we've been accumulating the pressure, and all of a sudden there's a bit of an outlet, for the steam, and so it's just people are just trying to escape. I would say condition of living that is not humanly acceptable. Right. So it can be war, but it can be diseases, and the thing is, what is clear to me is we should be really careful on how we are looking at people on the flee. And we should not, I would say, judge, why people are fleeing. People are fleeing because it's not bearable. And I think it's really, I would say, normal for human being for hoping for a brighter future. Everybody, I think, has the right for a brighter future.
And you said that you were just shocked and surprised back in Ebola, and you're equally frustrated that governments have not been heeding the warnings of problems that have taken quite a long time to gestate. What is the problem? Do you have an insight? I know maybe it's unfair to ask for somebody who's really come up through the field, but you are now the public face of MSF. You have to go to the UN. You have to go to the World Health Organization, bang the tables on behalf of your staff, members, colleagues. Can you share any insights of what you think is structurally wrong? Is it simply that we as publics don't have the appetite, so we don't pressure our politicians? Or are there some type of structural obstacles that you think are there that you would know how to fix?
I would never have the presumption that I can know how to fix the world's problem. I don't think I can have that pretension. But what I can tell you is I think there's a huge vacuum of political leadership in the world right now. And I think that's what we saw for Ebola, when nobody wanted to just take the leadership and just step up, to what, their responsibility nationally but internationally. And then it's the same thing today, is like everybody right now is looking at each other to figure out, are we going to fix the Yemen crisis right now? And are we going to come up with a political solution while we are in this really, I would say, bloody military phase of the conflict? Yeah. And so I think that somehow there's a lack of political courage and leadership across the world.
But the creation of groups like the World Health Organization, even the role that UN plays more broadly, is meant to help coalesce that leadership, is meant to help bring it together or nurture it rather than you having to do it or other humanitarian organizations. Is there something about, do you think, the World Health Organization that could operate differently? Is there an early warning approach that you think could be handled differently? Do you find when you're in the field with your MSF colleagues that there isn't a presence of these organizations there to take the message back? Is there anything that you think these organizations could be doing differently to mobilize political leadership?
I wish I would have the answer to your question, but what I can tell you and what we see in the field right now is there is a lot of crises that are not attended and don't find any actor to respond to it. And we are in this, I find, very paradoxical situation that we've never seen such a huge international workforce in terms of humanitarian aid worker, as well as budget for humanitarian aid that is now up to 17 billion, according to the last figures for 2014. But that being said, and despite all that, we still are seeing situations like I just returned from South Sudan, where we have a camp for displaced people, where people don't even have the basics, which is shelter, food, and medical care. I don't believe that in the 21st century, we just cannot address that. I don't believe that we accept, as an international community, this kind of situation. We don't accept it, MSF. We try to do our best, but we cannot be the fireman of the world. Some other people is going to need to take their responsibility. And this needs to happen. But somehow I find there is, I would say, some sort of complacency, and often, and I think Ebola was a great example of that, is people have taken for granted that for the emergency response, somehow MSF as an organization and few other organizations will take the brunt of the beginning of the response, and after that people are going to try to figure it out. And there's this huge, I would say, lack of sense of urgency in trying to save lives in the world. We're numb to, I would say, loss of life. We just don't see, the stories of human beings behind. And I find it absolutely, I would say, unacceptable. I don't find enough and strong enough word to express my feeling on that, I guess.
That lack of empathy, I think, part of the issue, but as you said, is a stronger issue. Do you think groups like MSF are now, given perhaps the lack of governments and international organizations' ability to get involved early enough, are you starting to have to play a different role in these crisis environments, helping build up training for health? I noticed that you'd given out, I think, during the Ebola crisis, over 2 million malaria shots or vaccinations. In other words, it was almost like MSF had to step in with others' support, I'm sure other organizations as well, to almost become health systems. Are you having to help coordinate? Are you able to leave behind a stronger health system than you found when you first got there? Are you becoming part of the infrastructure for these countries, given that government's not doing it? Are you able to leave behind more than you find, or do you just have to move from crisis to crisis to crisis?
I think a lot of people would like MSF to change in terms of building capacity, and I think that we do see ourselves as an organization, a humanitarian medical organization that brings assistance to people in need, secondary to conflicts, natural disaster, epidemics. And then we do respond in the emergency phase. And then we have to decide for ourselves now is how much of I would say, the midterm, long-term, are we going to be there?
Right.
And the reality is, we like to tell ourselves that we're only there for the emergency phase, but if we look at our, I would say, record, we've been for more than 2 decades in Democratic Republic of Congo. We've been in South Sudan since 1983. Of course, we had some I would say, absence, but we've been since the 80s in Afghanistan. So the reality is we have what I call the mid-long-term relationship with many different countries,
yeah.
and then we don't make the commitment somehow. So we're going to need to reflect a little bit more on that, and that's a fundamental question for the organization, because this might change, some people say, like our DNA.
Exactly.
So, and we might not be ready for a DNA makeup.
I mean, how many people here probably won't know how MSF is structured in that sense. I mean, is it volunteer doctors who are coming in and able, there's a crisis, you call up, there's a team you can bring in. But you said you've had permanent presences in many countries, permanent, semi-permanent, for 20, 25, 30 years. What's this balance between being a sort of quick response, having a network that you can bring to bear on a crisis, and how much now is it permanent staff? What's that balance at MSF?
Well, MSF exists in 1971, and then it was created from this, what we call voluntary spirit. So it's always been there, the voluntary spirit, but the reality is voluntary or aging. We are volunteer people who are aging and getting older and older, so with different needs. So we are adapting, but the reality is we have 35,000 workers across the world, and we have 28 offices, and basically we still have people with this really voluntary basis who wants to go and make a difference in the field, but we have as well adapted to as we are aging and maturing. We are in our middle age, 44 years middle age. So we are going into a huge middle age crisis as well.
Well, there's obviously no shortage of topics that you have to undertake at the moment. Let me ask you a question. How are you able to preserve your independence in countries that you go into? This issue of how NGOs relate to the countries that they operate in, how they maintain their values, their standards. How does MSF think about this issue of independence? Is it simply taking care of people, it doesn't matter about the government? How do you deal with that issue?
Well, I think we mix a lot of those principles, because we often talk about neutrality, impartiality, and independence. We often we tag on our independence to our financial independence.
Right.
And I think that today, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders have the unique, I would say, privilege of being at 90% financially independent. It's meaning our 90% of, meaning that 90% of our money comes from private donors, and we have an income budget of 1.3 billion. So we are absolutely fortunate today. And this what gave us, I would say, our edge and our, I would say, capacity to not have to wait for any grant to go and just say, we want to go there and we need to go now. And then we can mobilize a team within a couple of hours. So this is something very important. It is as well important because in regards to some conflicts, like if we take Afghanistan, we are completely in private funds, and in many conflict areas we are completely in private funds. We do believe that it's important to be totally financially independent.
I want to make sure I can open up and let me give people a chance to ask some questions. So if you could think up a couple of questions, I want to ask one last, I suppose, tough question in a way. I mean, how do you approach the issue of risk for your staff? how do you balance when a situation is too dangerous, not dangerous enough? How do you tackle that incredibly difficult call of you're needed often in the most dangerous environments? Is this on a case-by-case basis? Is it left very much to the local leaders on the ground? How do you handle this issue of risk?
Risk, it's, I would say, a daily, question for our organization. And there's no one-size-fits-all approach for all the conflict. We take it case by case. And then it's really important that I think that anyone who goes to the field taking upon themselves that they're taking a personal risk, but the organization do its due diligence in terms of figuring out, do we have the insurance to go and care for patients who need our assistance? And sometimes we get the insurances from the local, I would say, authorities, and as well at the regional and in the international, and sometimes we don't. And so there are some areas that we pull out. We left Somalia a few years ago. There's some areas in Syria that we are not there because we cannot find the insurances that we can go and work there. But what is clear to us is like we are not there for human sacrifice. We are not martyr. This is not what is MSF about, and we need to be clear about that. We wish we could do much more in some crises, like Syria and even like Yemen. But this is sometimes we reach a limit of what we can handle. And I think I'm just going to add that because Kunduz is a very, very difficult situation for us. I guess there's no words. There's no words for my organization in terms of how this has been so difficult. And so, and then we have closed our Kunduz Trauma Center, and we know that there are millions of Afghan people who cannot benefit from the trauma care that we've been giving for the last 4 years. And so this is, when you were talking about risk, is until we understand what happened, how it happened, we cannot go back to Kunduz. And this is why we are asking for an impartial, independent investigation. If we don't get clarity on that, we will not be able to go back to Kunduz.
Very important point to make the transition from, because I'm sure even in the media, people are saying, well, look, fog of war, et cetera, terrible tragedy, these things happen. The point you're making here, just so I completely get it, is in a way, as you said, unless you understand how it happened, you can never have the confidence to be able to say to your staff, to your people, this is a place we know we can be in, because that thing will not happen again because we know why it happened. Yes, if you don't know why it happened, you can never trust the assurance that you might get again, correct?
Well, we somehow, we need to know what happened and why it led to airstrike on a hospital who's been known in the region for the last 4 years, who've been treating thousands of people. We need to understand why. And my goal today is because we want to prevent occurrence of another event like this. That's one thing. But the other big thing and the bigger picture for me is to safeguard the ability to work in conflict zone, the ability for population living in conflict zone accessing healthcare. That's what is at stake today. Because otherwise, if we don't get, reaffirmation of the Geneva Convention by different states and by obviously the international community, we will not be able to continue to work in some crisis zone like Yemen, like South Sudan, like Central African Republic.
So just to stay on that, you think, depending on the answer you get here, you may have to think about other regions where you are currently, or other places where you are currently based. The Kunduz thing may change MSF's outlook more broadly. You'd have to look at risk differently.
I would not formulate it this way. What I'm trying to say, and I guess I'm not clear, is the fact that Kunduz is one thing, and then we need to get clarity about Kunduz, and that will have a direct impact on our, I would say, deployment in Afghanistan. But on a more broader thing, and this is why we bring it to the world, is the fact that it is important today that we safeguard what I call the humanitarian medical space, meaning the ability for healthcare workers to work in conflict zone, but as well the access of the general population to healthcare, meaning that we cannot target patients, we cannot target medical facilities, we cannot target ambulances, we cannot target healthcare workers. That's the bottom line. And then that's what the Geneva Convention is giving us. And we've been working under the understanding that people are respecting that. And this is why in our calculation, when we go and negotiate, and when you were asking about risk, we weight all that in. And then if somehow we decide that this is not respected anymore, then that puts everything, in I would say, we question everything after that. So the impact of what happened in Kunduz has a huge impact on MSF organization, but has a huge impact on the whole humanitarian community. That's what it's all about.